handled language identification in Lengua, Palenquera, and Spanish, and obviously I also traveled to Bogota, Medellin, and Palenque. So at the beginning, I just have more pictures. Like Sarah said, we spent a lot of time at the university, but we also had a lot of time to travel around the city and see other areas, which definitely added a lot to our experience. In the top left corner, there was a castle that we got to see. We took a ride on the rail car, which I think was really important to us to see what life was like outside of the concentrated part of the city. And went to a coffee farm, met the cute dog, and went on hikes. And we traveled to Guatapé, where Sarah had the picture from the hike, and then we also stopped at other towns on the way, which is really fun. So for my project, like I said, I was looking at language identification. So my two main questions were, how do individuals differentiate between the two languages, Lengua, Palenquera, and Spanish? And are there certain phonetic traits that allow an individual to distinguish between the two languages? So for me, I thought this research was important because for the community members to continue to teach it to their children and students, it's important that they understand how to distinguish between the two languages so they can better explain it to them. So some of the distinct traits of Lengua that I looked at were the intonation. It's been described as a sing-song pattern and very unique and identifiable. And they also substitute L for R. So for example, they change arroz to alo. And then prenasalization of voiced word initial stops. So bala to umbala. And these were the traits that I mainly focused on. There obviously are some other differences, but these were the easiest one to identify. So I had two different experiments. The first one was just focused on intonation. And the participants would hear stimuli. They were in either Lengua or Spanish. And they had two different tasks for this part. The first stimuli were just low-pass filtered, so they still could hear the intonation pattern, but they couldn't understand the words. And then the second task, they were flatlined and low-pass filtered, so it really was just the rhythm, and there wasn't much of a difference between Lengua and Spanish. So I actually have examples. This was the original sentence in Spanish, so it hasn't been filtered yet.
Palenque estaba mucho mejor.
And then this is what it sounded like low-pass filtered. And then flatlined. So obviously a lot of the participants thought they were listening to something wrong when they heard that, but we just had to explain to them to keep trying and finish it. And then the second task was the same different task. So this part I was looking at more of the phonological traits like the R to L and the prenasalized stop. So they would hear two words at the same time, and they either were from the same language, so two from Lengua or two from Spanish, or they were different, and they could have an ambiguous difference. For example, casa is essentially the same word in both languages, or they had distinct difference, like the R to L or prenasalized stop, like cara. And then all they were doing was pressing a button saying if they were the same language or different language. So for these tasks, I hypothesized for the first task that they would correctly identify the sentences that were low-pass filtered, but I didn't expect them to be successful with ones that were flatlined just because they sounded very odd. And then for the second task, I expected them to be correct when they were from different languages and had distinct difference, or if they were from the same language. But I didn't expect them to be successful if there's an ambiguous difference, like I said, with the word casa. So after I collected my data, I began analyzing it. I used Excel to calculate things such as the percent correct in Spanish or Lengua, looked at their reaction times. I also had to go back and exclude some of the data. For example, if they had really low reaction times, like 0 or 1, that meant that they were pressing the button before the speaker even finished the recording, so they probably weren't actually distinguishing between them. Or if I went back and looked and they pressed one button the whole time except for like 3 times, then they likely weren't distinguishing them either. And then after that, I ran 2 sample t-tests for significance to see which ones they performed better on. So from the first task that was focused on intonation, the participants, like I hypothesized, did significantly better when it was in Lengua or if it was just low-pass filtered, not flatlined. I also looked to see if there's a difference when the speaker, some of them were male and some were female, so participants randomly were chosen which one they got, and there wasn't a significant difference in their performance based on the gender of the speaker. For the second task, I found a lot of interesting results. Just in general, they were more successful at identifying them if the stimuli were from same language, they were better at identifying lengua, and also they were better at identifying two words from the same language in lengua compared to ones that were from different languages. And within the ones that were different, I also looked to see if there's a difference in their success with ones that just had an ambiguous difference or a distinct difference. So for this, I categorized all of the R to L prenasalized stop. If they had two differences or they had a different difference that I wasn't actually focused on, they were classified as distinct. And I looked to see if they were more successful with the ambiguous or distinct differences. And these graphs are divided by gender, but they were significantly better identifying when the two stimuli had a distinct difference. Like I expected, it made more sense. But there also wasn't a difference when comparing one phonological difference to the other. So, for example, they weren't better when there was an L substitute for an R compared to when there was a prenasalized stop. So I thought that was interesting because I expected some of the differences might be more identifiable than the other, and I also thought if there were two differences, then they would be better at identifying those, but there wasn't a difference there. So overall, my results support my hypothesis for what I expected. The participants appeared to favor Lengua Palenquera and perform better when the stimuli were in that language. And it also suggested that the unique phonetic traits are beneficial for identifying the language. And like I said, there wasn't any evidence that one phonological trait was more helpful than another. And for future experiments, I looked back to see what I thought worked, what didn't work, how I could improve it for the future. For my instructions, I had them pre-recorded, which was definitely really helpful with my limited Spanish abilities. But I think it would have been helpful to also add an example or like a practice round during the instructions, because it was usually after like the first 5 stimuli that I could tell if they were just completely confused and pressing buttons, and then I would have to like stop them. So that would definitely prevent that and give me better data, I think. Also, the modality of the experiment, for both tasks, they were just pressing a button. For the first one, it was Spanish or Lengua, and for the second one, it was same or different. So they were just pressing buttons, so it allowed them to be a little bit more passive. If they didn't understand, they could have just continued pressing buttons and I wouldn't have known. So adding a more active component, and that might even look like an instant feedback to tell them after they press it if it was correct, so to motivate them and tell them that they can actually do it. I think for the first task, a lot of people thought it was impossible the way it sounded, so I'm not sure if they really understood. So I think it would be helpful to see like, oh, you got right that time, you can identify them. And also for the future, I'd like to look at if there are any differences between generations. The younger generations have gotten rid of some of the sounds that older generations use. For example, the prenasalized stop they don't use. So it would be interesting to see if they're as sensitive to this difference compared to older generations.